Olga Oliker is the International Crisis Group's program director for Europe and Central Asia, and she's just, I think, a terrific voice when it comes to understanding what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. Olga, thanks so much for talking to us again.
Very happy to be back.
Ukraine is emerging from, a disappointing counteroffensive. Uh, you have said it's short of weapons and personnel, money stalled in Washington. Europe's ability to deliver weapons is also in question. You're not painting a very bright picture.
It's not a very bright picture. I suppose the good news is that all is not lost yet. But look, these are things people have been talking about for months, and they're still talking about them. And you can go to places like the Munich Security Conference, and everybody talks this great talk about support for Ukraine and this war is existential for Europe. But the reality is that the money is very much not where their mouths are.
Some people would say that the Munich Security Conference, because you brought it up, was one of the most disappointing security conferences in memory. That there was a lot of talk, but when you really look at was there any traction on Ukraine, there's a lot of disappointment.
Well, I wasn't there, so I can't give you a personal impression. But I think that, look, we're in a place where Zelensky came to that conference on the heels of signing security assistance deals with the French and the Germans, which in turn followed such a deal with the UK. So what they're doing is making good on G7 commitments that they made on the sidelines of the Vilnius NATO summit, which are that we're going to sign deals with Ukraine that promise that we will continue to provide support of the sort we are providing. And I think they mean it, right? They will. They really do see this as crucial to their security. The problem is that it's the United States that has had the easiest logistical time of it, providing more weapons. And the United States has pretty much stopped doing that because of domestic politics. And what the UK and France and Germany and Sweden and the Czech Republic and all of the rest of them can do is simply more limited. Now, they could still do more, right? I think the big gap in Europe has been an unwillingness to sign the long-term contracts that European firms want in order to produce the kind of weaponry that the governments want them to produce. So they could do that. But it takes time, right? It's not push a button and ammunition starts to come off the
Well,
assembly line.
precisely. So has time slipped away? I mean, we're 2 years into this, and they're still talking about, revving up assembly lines and doing more to provide what the US is not providing.
So this has been, I think, a huge gap for the Europeans. And it's not an absence of capacity, right? European firms can do this. What they need is the contracts. And yes, a certain amount of time has slipped away. And I think a lot of it is about expecting the United States to continue to fill the gap, but the United States hasn't, right? Because a small group of congressional Republicans has been able to be disproportionately influential and prevent the money and therefore the guns from flowing.
So is President Trump helping right now? Former President Trump, suggesting that, his country will not protect NATO member states if they fail to meet these spending minimums, and that he's even said he would invite Russia to attack NATO member states. So surely he's helping people get serious, as ludicrous as some of his comments may be.
So look, the commitments to spend more on defense on the part of the NATO members were made at Vilnius. They were made before Vilnius. They keep getting more and more commitment-y. They also are spending more. Another commitment they made was to spend, I believe, 20% of their defense budgets on defense industry. That would be a good one to move along, I don't know, about a year ago, but we'll settle for now. Um, so look, does Donald Trump help? In a kind of perverse way, he does, because he drives home the point that this isn't perhaps an aberration, that the United States maybe isn't as reliable as you'd like it to be. And if indeed, Europe, this is a war for your security, for your existential, for your existence as Europe, then you need to think about what to do if the United States isn't fully reliable. And of course, during the 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency, this was something that occurred to everybody, but then that presidency ended and they all breathed a giant sigh of relief. And now they're starting to get serious again. And it's, I think, watching, well, from the inside, I'm sitting here in Brussels, but watching not as a European, but as an American, it's frustrating. But it's kind of, it's a very slow process. The problem is Ukraine does not have a ton of time.
They certainly don't. Do you think that the front lines in Ukraine, given what we've just seen in Avdiivka, and there's a lot of different pictures that were painted on the retreat. Some say it was an orderly retreat.
Mhm.
Some of the stuff I've read is that it was pretty chaotic, and a lot of Ukrainians died in that retreat. Do you think the front lines are beginning to collapse in Ukraine, that it is that critical, or what's your analysis?
Look, Ukraine is moving to a defensive footing, which it needs to do. It needs to do that for several reasons. One is pushing the counteroffensive didn't work. Two is they're low on weapons, and a defensive position basically just uses less ammunition than trying to be on the offense. They also need to build up their force size. They need to mobilize and train more people as well as get more weapons into the stockpile. So all of those call for shifting to defensive positions. Some of that means falling back and getting two positions that are defensive. Now, you can do that in a very organized, thought out way, but there's no way to do that without looking like you're retreating. You are retreating. As it happens, they're doing it under Russian fire as they're being forced back by Russians, taking generally small amounts of territory, but the Russians are taking that territory and they're pushing the Ukrainians back. Um, in terms of what happened in Avdiivka specifically, yes, you're absolutely going to get all sorts of stories. I think the bottom line is there was not a way for the Ukrainians to hold it. Whether they could have done a better job on the retreat, he could always do a better job.
Do you think it's the first in a series? Do you think that we should understand there's going to be more Avdiivkas?
So Russia is pushing pretty much all along the line of contact. And Ukraine has to determine what it can defend and where it wants to dig in and how it wants to get to those positions. And then from that point, it can see what it can do, whether it's launching offensive actions where possible, and when that's possible, I don't know. But I think right now we are seeing the Russians continue to push forward.
Do you think that some of this plays into the replacement of Ukraine's top general Zaluzhny, that he and Zelensky just didn't see eye to eye? Zelensky was pushing offensive operations. Zaluzhny was reportedly just saying that they were in a stalemate, months before Zelensky actually acknowledged it, and that he had a different vision of where the war was going. And it may be that Zaluzhny was spot on versus Zelensky, who is always campaigning for more Western support, always painting a picture of an optimistic picture, that maybe some of that replacement of Zaluzhny was rooted in some stark realities.
Look, I don't like the term stalemate for this conflict because I think of it in chess terms, and in chess terms, it's the end of the game, and we're not at the end of the game. We are at a place where the Ukrainians were unable to move forward, and the Russians now are moving forward, but tiny amounts of territory with tremendous losses. This is a fight that favors defense. So, that's just kind of what it is. I think the very public fight between Zaluzhny and Zelensky is a breakdown of civil military relations and a reflection of the problem with civil military relations in Ukraine, which is a longstanding one. Um, but I also don't know, it's not that I think Zaluzhny would have somehow prevented the Russians from taking Avdiivka, right? Um, and I try not to be an armchair warrior that questions the decisions made by people who have more information than I do and who are actually responsible for the lives of the people under their command. These are very tough. These are very tough
Yeah.
choices, and war is unpredictable.
What would you say about Ukraine's manpower situation? I mean, they're, and I know you've covered it
Mhm.
in some of your material from the International Crisis Group, and some of your experts have talked about it. I mean, I was struck by one of the sessions that you did, where they said, you know, a lot of the guys in the front line, they've been there 2 years. I mean, 2 years in some of the worst conditions since World War II. Um, Serving in the army, you know, very few breaks. They're tired, they're worn out. The average age, according to one of your experts, is on the front line is 43 years old. Did I get that right?
So Ukraine made a conscious decision not to mobilize young people. They mobilized people with prior military experience and just prior experience in general. So you get an older fighting force. And as one Ukrainian official pointed out to me, you also get people who don't run as fast, right? Or as long. You get people
Yeah.
who, you know, but you also get people with experience, and you're not drawing down your young men, and it is predominantly men. One of the things they are looking at doing now is mobilizing younger people. Um, the big challenge for Ukraine is fixing a mobilization system so that people feel confident coming in and joining this force. Ukrainians, if you look at the public opinion polls, they support this war, right? It's a war for their very survival. They get it. But the reports you hear from soldiers are that it's not clear where you're going to be assigned when you're mobilized, that it's not clear what the rotation is, if there is a rotation. So if they can fix that, they're probably going to get at least somewhat better responses. When people get mobilization notices, they're going to be more likely to show up. But
Okay.
you know, Ukraine hasn't run out of people it could mobilize, but it has to make decisions to actually mobilize them. And it needs to set up a system that doesn't punish them and their families for responding.
The assistance piece, as you've referred to it, and even if the U.S. can unclog its very difficult politics in Washington, and there's no sign of that. That right now, essentially, the U.S. works on sending needed equipment to Ukraine using existing stocks and then new procurements. Do I get it right that the existing stocks are dwindling to the point that the Department of Defense is not comfortable sending any more, and that the new stocks are several years in a pipeline, even if you direct the money to commission those new weapons?
So there, yeah, I mean, as you said, there's two pots of weapons for which the US is drawing. One is stockpiles. And what the US has liked to do is send Ukraine stuff as they replenish. They don't have the supplemental, if they don't have the funding to replenish, they don't want to keep sending the stockpiles because then the US doesn't have a stockpile anymore, right? So that's kind of the first pot, the first bucket. The second,
And that's one of the most critical ones because that arrives quickly. That's you
yeah,
just
exactly.
take that out of a warehouse, push it on a plane, and get it rolling.
That's stuff that exists.
Yeah.
The other piece of this is procurement, and those are contracts. And different things take different amounts of time to build on contracts. Some things take 6 months, some things take 2 years. So there are things that have been contracted for that Ukraine is going to keep receiving, right? Because they are being built, right? Whichever defense firm got the order is assembling whatever it is, and it is going to get shipped when it's finished. But with no new contracts, you're not going to get more of this stuff. And you know, that's the problem with that. So on the one hand, you don't have the replenishment of US stockpiles, and on the other, you don't have the money to just buy new things that the defense industrial firms, which are, you know, they're American firms. It's American jobs. It's money to American towns and cities, but they're not producing without the contracts.
And even if the log jam is broken in Washington, there's lag time
There's
in
a lag. There is
between commission and manufacture and delivery.
right. You can't, I mean, yeah, it's not magical.
Yeah. In the meantime, people are dying. I probably, you know, I left the headline to the last, and it maybe should have been the first thing I asked you about because it also plays into this. But when you look at the death of Alexei Navalny in prison, in Russia. They still haven't turned over the body. There are all sorts of demands for that. Now they're saying it could be 2 weeks before they do that, and lots of questions about why they don't want to do that. Do you think what is the fallout from it in terms of does it play in the West in such an alarming way of how brutal and nasty this regime is in Russia that may provide some new impetus to people saying Putin's got to be dealt with. We've got to get behind Ukraine because that's the last line of defense.
Look, I think it certainly lends strength to that argument, right? The answer to the question, what do you do about this, is support Ukraine. I also will say that I don't know a Russian citizen who isn't wrecked, who has not been wrecked since Friday. And I think it's important to understand it that for Russians who have a different vision for their country, this is a kick in the ribs to somebody who's bleeding out from having been brutally beaten anyway. Right? And it's an effort to tell all of those people, give up. There is no hope for a different Russia. This is the Russia. And you're seeing that community or that set of communities grapple with that situation. But I think for the rest of us, for Americans and Europeans, it really does have to be about either supporting Ukraine or figuring out how you're going to deal with the consequences if you don't.
Olga Oliker, Olga, thank you so much for your time. Olga from the International Crisis Group. It's always a privilege to talk to you. I think you're terrific, and your organization has such great insights on what's been taking place. So I thank you so much for sharing some of your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.